So, hello everyone, I'm Carla Kopp. I'm a game designer, publisher, developer, and whatnot. And this is the perfectly amazing Daniel Solis, who does like all the things. He does art direction and game design, and he's designed games such like Junk Orbit and Kodama, Kodama Duo, and like, I don't know, 20 other games? Who knows how many? But Daniel can tell more about himself right now if he wishes.
Hi, that just about covers it, really. I'm a game designer. My day job is doing graphic design for board games, and that's kind of what I do most of the day. And that's kind of covers it. Hopefully, I'll talk a little bit more in detail.
Well, you missed one thing, which was you did this fantastic YouTube series at one
right.
point.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah, I need to do more of that. Jeez Louise. Okay. Yes, I did a YouTube series called Card at Work that goes over the basics of card design and setting up prototype card games and board games too. But my main specialty is doing large volume decks of cards as efficiently as possible using a couple different techniques in InDesign and spreadsheets and something called data merge. And since I posted those videos, gosh, going on 5 years ago, I think, I've had a few people say that they've made their prototypes using these methods, and that's really nice. It's heartening to hear.
But he also has a Patreon if you want to like get those early. Like if you still do that, I don't know.
You can contribute to the Patreon. More of what I'm posting now is text-based and occasionally some images. It's tricky because what I do now is a lot of it is kind of secret, so I can't really like say if I learn something new, I can't show the place where I'm using that technique. So it's like hard to talk about it in the abstract, because it basically means I have to make a whole separate project to show an example of what I'm doing elsewhere, and like it's tough to get the energy to get that going. But I'm doing my best to maintain that Patreon, and thank you to all the patrons who are still supporting it, even though it's slowed down a little bit, to be honest. But I'm still trying.
Yeah. I mean, we're all human. You can't expect too much, especially during a pandemic where we're all like kind of freaking out inside. But anyway, game design. So where do you usually start when you go to like make your first prototype of a card?
If I know what the game is already, if I'm you're talking about if I'm designing the game versus well, for me, when I was doing my card games like really rapidly, a lot of what I would do is explore the physicality of a card and just see what I could do with a card that only a card could do, or that a card could do best. So there were a couple like fun experiments that eventually led to things like Kigi, which was eventually republished as Kodama. And in that game, you would just have cards that overlapped each other, and there were pictures of tree branches on them, and you would line them up so that you'd have this pretty picture of a tree that would gradually grow as you laid more and more cards out. And the appealing thing to me about that initial concept was that it was tile laying without it being so strictly gridded. So you can have this more organic feel to it as it's spread across your table. And it's usually things like that would spur more interesting game design ideas. It was really just the physicality of the actual like material or the surface or the weight. And a couple other like odd things. I did a dexterity game where you like slide cards, but the theme of it was like penguins sliding on an iceberg towards a bunch of treats. Little things like that. It's kind of where I start. And once I know what the gameplay is going to be like, then I have to figure out, okay, how much information is going to be on each individual card? Where is the card going to be located most often during the game? Is it going to primarily be in hand? Is it going to be on the table? And that controls how much information density it can have, whether it's primarily text-based information versus image-based information. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it.
Well, let's just start. You said a lot of really good things. When do you choose to make the information image-based versus text-based?
That's usually, say for example, I can pull up an image here if it's not going to break everything. Do I just hit present now?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. A window. Let's see. I'm toggling through some tabs in Acrobat. Can you see me changing?
Yes, you're on Seastead right now.
Okay. Let's go to Etten. Etten was a project that I just did a couple months ago. That the card game is kind of a trading card game, but quite literally a trading card game in that you do a Seven Wonder style pick and pass draft between your neighbors, and one of your neighbors is an enemy and one of your neighbors is an ally, and so you go through these different phases where you're trying to get a good deck of cards to compete against your enemy by sharing drafting pools with your ally. So there's a lot going on, and it's a interesting, like, complicated game, and you have to be able to read what each card does at a very quick glance. So as I was working on the layout for this, there were some suggestions from the game's designer, the game's inventor, about how to present information. And so I did my best to take some of those ideas that had been very well tested and well developed, and see what I could do to enhance those as much as I could and support those with additional steps. So it's a little bit low res, but I think you can. This is actually not a bad way to display it, because you can see in these cards that there's information on the top left that represents the strength of the card. The icon below that number represents the sorry, I'm selecting stuff. The icon below that number represents the faction that it belongs to. Below that is victory points, if it's worth any. And that's kind of like some very critical information that you have to have as you're holding the card in your hand. But as you're like sharing these cards with your neighbor, you'll also be looking at the top line of the card. So that is the blue bar versus the red bar, which has relevance as you compete against your enemy. And some of the weaknesses that some of the cards have are represented by icons on the red cards as well. So you have to be cautious of that. Like, okay, if I take this card, it's protecting me, but this protection is weak against these particular things, catapults or flying units or things like that. And each card also has abilities, which you can see on the abilities section. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit so I can see this. So there's a couple bits of information on this card that is relevant. The first being that it has the scouting ability, which is represented by an eye. Its other ability is vicious, which is represented by these like claw marks. And that is shown at a glance just on the top of the card. And these abilities repeat a lot throughout the deck. There's only so many abilities that are used, and so several units just have different combinations of different abilities. So over time, you become familiar with what these icons do. But if you do need the extra support and reminder of what these cards do and what the abilities mean, you can look at the bottom of the card where you have the full, complete text of what the ability is called, when it resolves, and what the ability actually does. And the color of the icon is also relevant because it's co-coded or double coded with the little tiny icon just above the ability. In this case, this red icon has this card little rectangle icon with some lines coming out of it. That represents that it occurs as soon as that card is deployed. And the green icon with a little hand with a hand kind of picking up stuff over there. These are that icon represents that ability occurs when you're picking up your spoils after a battle. So, like I said, there's a lot of information that goes on, and that is even getting to the icons and numbers on the bottom of the card. On the bottom right, you can see that there's information about which age this card comes out in, what the cost is to recruit that card into your deck, and what you gain if you sell the card off to just gain money so you can recruit other cards. There's a lot of information that needs to be presented and then you multiply this by however many cards you're trading back and forth with your allies. It's a lot to keep up with. And so this was an interesting game to lay out, and then on top of that, I was coming into this job, coming into joining the company, kind of in the middle of this project. So I was kind of coming in halfway through and doing some quick pickups, updating some of the art, revising some of the systems behind the scenes to make revisions to the cards a little bit more quick and fast. I hope that answers some questions. I think I've meandered a little bit. Sorry.
It happens. So, would you say that like you should use icons for things that are like critical information that you need like at a real quick glance, and for abilities that repeat a lot?
Yes, I think that's the best use of it. If you have some games where every card has unique abilities, for example, then I think in those cases it's best to just use text. Say like Magic the Gathering, where so often there are unique effects that cards have, or they're so complex that it would be difficult to convert those into hieroglyphics. But it's also Magic is a different situation because most of the time the card is sort of in your hand, and when you put it out, then it becomes relevant to your opponent, in which case then they would pick up the card and look at it. Oh, what does that do? Oh, right. Magic gets around this with keywords, which are another way that you can condense a lot of information into a quick at-a-glance thing. So instead of explaining the rules of flying units every single time, you can just put a keyword flying. This unit is flying, and everyone knows what that means. In this case, there's still, like any game, going to be a little bit of a learning curve. But I think where Etten has some strength is that there's very consistent, repeated use of certain keywords, and then we pair those keywords with certain icons, and we don't deviate from that. We don't introduce new icons for abilities that only exist on one card, for example. There's not a lot of outliers, and we just try to, as much as possible, be very consistent so that once you learn one or two cards, you basically learn what the rest of the cards do as well.
Do you have any like basis for when you choose to make a keyword, like an actual keyword in your game?
In my games, yeah. I use keywords typically to represent, say, a verb. For example, if I have a card effect that says when you use this ability, here, let me switch over to my screen again. Can I stop presenting?
There should be a stop button.
Yeah, there we go. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I use a keyword, it's typically when I have a special sequence of actions that needs to be conveyed very quickly. Say, for example, if you're doing a space game and you play an alien, and the alien's special effect is that every time an alien comes out, you draw a card. Then you can have a keyword for that is, say, for example, like bounty, for example. And so every alien has bounty. So then you can just kind of like remember, okay, oh, I got bounty, boom, 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 take a card. But sometimes there are more complex effects. Just to take an example from Magic again, Magic the Gathering has, for like 20 some years, had this sequence of actions where you would take the top card from your deck and put it directly into your discard pile. And for the most part, people colloquially would say the word mill to represent that. So I have milled you, or you're milling me, or I'm milling myself. And it was just sort of a casual slang, but only recently, in this most recent set, have they actually finally made a keyword, mill, that means exactly that. So in some senses, keywords happen organically, and as much as I would love to make up my own cool language like Android Netrunner did for pretty much every single zone of play and all that stuff, I also have to realize, like, sometimes I have to just use normal language. Drawing a card means drawing a card. I can't like change the meaning of drawing a card just for my game because I think it's cuter to do it one way or another. There was one game where I had a card effect that I wanted to use bury to represent putting a card underneath your deck. So taking a card from your hand, putting underneath your deck, which has its own mechanical differences between that and discarding. if it's discard, it's a separate zone. So you could search your discard pile, you could shuffle your discard pile, do some other stuff. So putting it underneath your deck mattered. And I wanted to use the word bury for that. But the feedback I got from a lot of people was that old school Magic used the word bury to mean a different thing, and it would be hard to shake that. And so in that case, I had to decide, is it worth retraining those players about what the word bury meant? Or are they such a small subset of players that I can go ahead and do my own thing and not worry about that? And most people wouldn't have any preconceived notion of what bury means. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variables to consider whenever I'm picking a keyword, but I think in most cases it's going to be a verb. I won't use if I have resources that are frequently tossed in and out of the game, for example. That's when I will use an icon. I typically won't use a keyword for that because I find it generally it takes up less space on the card to turn those things into icons. Yeah.
What did you end up deciding with that? Whether more people would be into the Magic term bury, or more people would just not know?
I just went ahead. To be honest, that prototype didn't really go anywhere, but I did proceed with just using bury in my own sense of the word, because for one thing, I had to consider the market, and my market was not old school vintage Magic players who had preconceived concepts of what that key term meant. So I felt pretty safe that even if there was some relearning that had to happen for those players, they weren't my primary target audience anyway, so it wasn't a real hindrance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I just brought that up because like that bury or like what you said would be bury is like a cool different like mechanic thing, but yeah, there's probably tons of different like Magic words that I don't know, mainly because I played Magic like, I don't know, 5 to 10 years ago.
Sure.
And I played during like a very certain period of time, but like Magic is, I don't know, however old it is, so like there's a lot of history in there, like where you said about mill, where like I knew what mill meant, but like that was never like an official term.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we should just all go look up what Magic terms are and get ideas for game design.
I'll be honest. I have had since the announcement about milling becoming a keyword, I have had this impulse to take every zone of a card game, make a spreadsheet out of it, like a multiplication table, and make a keyword verb that applies to moving one card from one zone to another. So draw is quite simple. Just it's where you intersect the deck to your hand. Those are two separate zones, and moving a card from the deck to your hand, that's drawing. And milling is apparently putting the card from the deck to your discard pile. And I just wanted to come up with more verbs for that. But that's not a great impulse. I can't just like make a game to justify that. Just making up new slang, as much as I would love to.
I mean, well, like I got really excited about it because like part of like, well, being a publisher and like doing all the blind play testing and making sure people just know what the words mean, like that's so hard. But like if there was just a list where it's like, please just everyone go learn what these words are and then let's play a game, it's gonna be so easy. I'll have to like not explain all that much, because like sometimes even drawing a card can be hard for some people. So I don't know, but yeah, that got me excited, but that's because I hate blind play testing. Charlie had a question. What were the biggest challenges in doing the graphics for the building blocks book?
Oh, wow. The building blocks book. Well, I happen to have some of the building blocks cards here that were a kind of a promotional item at BGG-Con last year during the, I forget what the actual name of the event is, the sort of the game design summit that happens before BGG-Con. So in case anybody doesn't know what this is, it's a book that, I don't know if you can see that title. It's a book called Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design by Jeff Engelstein and Isaac Shalev. It's more or less an encyclopedia of different board game mechanisms. And the idea is that this isn't a comprehensive list of every single possible mechanism, nor is it an all-encompassing, like this is the definition of this mechanism for all time. It's more descriptive than proscriptive. If any linguistics people are in the audience, the idea is that they just want to take some of the more common tropes that you would see in game design, or things that you might consider, and put a label to those just to make it easy to discuss as you proceed. And because there hadn't been like sort of even kind of really close to a cohesive lingua franca for this sort of thing. So part of that project that they hired me for was doing diagrams for every single one of these mechanics. I think there was like 200 some mechanics. Some things were fairly simple. Some things were, let me see here. I think I still have some on my computer I can bring up. But the idea of the book is that you would turn a page and you'd have an entry for, say, for example, trick taking. And you could just, ooh, hey, sweet. I think I have it up. Cool. Let me see if I can share with you this. Present now. Present a window. I will present this window. Let's see. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. All right, so this is just this is the first chapter of diagrams, and in the first chapter, it presented different structures of gameplay, and by the book's definition, structure just meant who all is competing against each other and who's working together, who are the primary protagonists of the game, and what are their alliances, more or less. So it starts off with something very simple, like everybody is in it for themselves. So every player versus each other. In the second section, it was cooperative. So everyone is together versus the game or a robot or an AI or what have you. In some cases, there were variable alliances. So you'd get some groups divided in half, some all against one of the other players. Of course, there would be solitaire games, which would be a person versus the robot. Then you'd have like some hidden agenda games where everyone is ostensibly against each other and also against the robot, but sometimes there could be shifting alliances that would result in, say, for example, in this case, oh, is this person in gray? Are they allied with the robot? Maybe, I don't know. Oh, and gosh, there were more complicated stuff like legacy games. So this is how I presented that with one player tearing up cards, another player writing stuff on a hex, a couple other people on a board. So that kind of gives you some example of how I approached this entire project. Is that I had this more or less a consistent cast of characters that I would use throughout the book, so that you would become familiar at least with some of these icons. These are all inspired by actually a Korean game show called The Genius, which I absolutely love. If anyone, if you're looking for it, you have to do some Googling to find The Genius, but I highly recommend it for anybody who loves games. Yeah, anyway, so I borrowed the way that they explained the rules of each of the games that had each episode, because I thought it was very nice, flat graphics that weren't too gaudy and didn't distract from the central goal of delivering this information. And I, in some cases, say for example, so I would take a basic template, say, okay, I've established that this first graphic means everybody is against each other. So that means I can use that same framing to make it smaller and then put another thing beside it so that you can tell this is a continuation or an extension of that first idea with additional like twist on it. Or in this case, where I change out one of the players for the robot and change the background and the outlines of those frames to be dashed so that you kind of know that the alliances here are kind of porous, that they may shift over time. The hardest part to get to the question is where some games are kind of some mechanics were very broad, say trick-taking games. there's any number of variety of trick-taking games, and conveying the central premise of how to show the multiple steps that would be involved with that was tricky. Let's see if I have card mechanisms. Sure do. Is that as big as it goes? All right. Oh yeah. Okay. So I think this was the trick-taking mechanism. Hopefully you can see that. So I had 4 players, each showing 1 card, and then the player who had the highest card in the trump suit was the winner. And prior to this, I had established that this trophy meant winner. There's no like label or legend that explained that. But the rest of the entry in the book did kind of go at length to describe who wins in these situations. So that I thought was like, okay, I'm showing that everybody is playing, like the first player is playing a 5 of clubs, next player is playing 7 of clubs, the last player is playing a 3 of clubs. And under normal circumstances, I was like, oh, do I even bother showing the trump suit mechanic at all? Do I just have everybody play clubs following suit and only show that the highest card player was the winner? Or do I take one of the more identifying mechanics of trick-taking games, the trump suit, and show that as the exemplar image of this entire mechanism? And that was tough, honestly. There were a lot of these were judgment calls, and there wasn't really like a hard science with it. Thankfully, Jeff and Isaac had their input and were very good at guiding me into what would be the best direction to go. And you can kind of see a little bit of some of the other language, the visual language that I would use elsewhere in the book, in order to show multiple moments in time as one image. In this case, turns. I often use these sort of chevron-shaped frames that showed multiple turns happening. So in this case, this was a climbing game mechanism. So it was someone playing a pair of 2s, pair of 4s. The third player passes. That means they're out for that hand. Fourth player playing a pair of 6s. The first player comes back around, and now they have to beat that. And so they play a pair of 8s. Everybody else can't beat that. And so that means that first player, having played the highest pair, is the winner. That's not any particular climbing game. In fact, that would break the rules of some climbing games, but I thought it would get across the idea that this is sort of an extension of the trick-taking mechanisms that were introduced in the prior chapter, showing a longer play cycle, playing multiple cards, showing people being out where you don't have to play if you don't want to. There's a lot of ideas to convey in these diagrams, and in some cases, they get a little bit complicated, like in this bottom one here, showing in the first step, everybody taking a card, and then the second step, passing the remaining cards, then the third step, taking the second card and then passing around. That was the pick and pass 7 Wonder style card drafting. I mean, I can't say that these are like perfect diagrams, but I did my best. There are 200 of these. Give me some slack.
Yeah, well, I think they're pretty good because, like, I knew the trick-taking one without you describing it, and I think the whole like chevron thing for showing like the amount of turns is really clever.
Yeah, hopefully these are clear enough. Sorry, I'm like trying to see how to stop presenting again.
It's fine. Connor had another question. Hopefully this isn't too big of a question, but how do you go about picking or designing an icon for specific actions?
Ooh, no, that's not a big question. So an icon for specific actions. Well, I think it's more or less the same method that I use for any icon, really. And typically I don't use icons for actions. More often it's what ends up happening is a diagram. If I need to show an example of a sequence of events, that typically will involve something more complex that shows an icon changing states or a card moving from one place to another. It'll have arrows typically. So when I do have to show visually an action, it's I mean, for one thing, I want clarity. I want it to be able to work without referencing color. It has to work in black and white, if possible. Color is fine, but at its root, I want it to not be color dependent. Typically, it's presented from with time moving from left to right, top to bottom, just because most of my audience is English speaking. But if the question is more about icons themselves, then what I look for is clear, simple silhouettes that, again, are color independent, that will be recognized even if they're tiny, like in line with text, so that if you're reading a sentence, you come across this icon, you can recognize it at a glance and convert that to whatever the symbol is meant to represent. Resources or a place on the game board, something like that. Actually, I have a not a bad example already up here from the building blocks of game design. Let's see if I can get this bigger so you can see real close. You go. Okay. So presenting. So this was the diagram that is more or less based on innovation, the card game innovation, where you have to tuck cards underneath other cards, and which edge of the card you show matters, which contributes to however many resources you have or what have you. In this case, I chose to decouple like innovation's theme of history and civilization building to something that I was hoping would be more generic and clear to most people. So in this case, I'd imagine this as being a game about building cars in a factory. So I visually imagine this as things that the factory would need and things that the factory would produce. So on the left side, I showed different types of metal, and I showed them as either circular pipes or squared off tube kind of shapes, or I-beams. And this is how I normally would approach an actual game, where if I have different materials, I want them to have a shared aesthetic, in this case, being outlines with filled in white, but they have a distinctive shape so that you also can tell them apart from each other, even though you know that they're visually grouped together. So in this game, this imaginary game, you have these three different types of metal. And if you take a card and you tuck it on the left side, that is the materials that you're converting into cars. If you tuck the card above, then that is the staff that you're hiring to work at the factory. And if you tuck it underneath in the bottom, that is the amount of power that is going into the factory to actually operate things. And in this imaginary game, I just imagined, okay, so these are the three things that you need, and the output of that is cars. And so that's where you would tuck things to the right, and that is the number of cars that this factory is producing from the materials, the staff, and the power that you're all collectively putting into this factory. And then I just have little triangle arrows that show things going in, and then one that goes out. That is more or less the mindset I would bring to pretty much any game that I'm doing graphic design or layout for. It's just imagining sort of the story of not just what is happening in the game and the game's fiction, but also what's happening at the table, and how often you need to refer to something just in a quick, at a glance moment. Again, this isn't a perfect example. There are some modifications I would make to this to make it a little bit clearer. I would probably fill in the edges of those metal bits so that you see a very solid circle, a very solid square, or a very solid eye. But this was mainly a quick example so that you could kind of get a sense of what the chapter of this book would be about. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, I think so. Jack had a question on accessibility. There's a lot of accessibility changes and fixes that can happen in the graphic design phase, accounting for color blindness, increasing text size, etc. Are there accessibility considerations that it helps to consider or deal with in early prototyping design phase?
So worrying about accessibility as you're doing the game design part of it before it gets to actual production?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it does matter. I think it's helpful for the publisher for you to have done your due diligence and and suggesting how you feel how some information should be best presented as you're playing the game, up to the point that you approach the publisher. You have played the game more often than anybody else, so you should have certainly had an opinion, at least, about where an icon should go, or how big the text should be, so that it's visible across the table or in your hand or whatnot. That said, I wouldn't stress out about it too much when you're in the prototyping phase, because so much can change when you've gone to a publisher and they have artists and they have graphic design staff that they've hired to do specifically this. So there's a bit of a balance there. You need to come in with your data and your research, for lack of a better word, about how to best present your information for your game. But you also have to kind of trust that the publisher is on your side and is also trying to make the game as easy to play as possible. And they're going to have their own input, which may differ from yours. So you can't get too married to whatever solutions that you've come up with for your prototype. Certainly, there have been many times where I have a certain way of presenting information in one of my games, and I am a graphic designer by trade, but still, in much the same way that a doctor is the worst patient, I know that I can't be the final say about how my game looks or is presented. There are going to be better solutions that someone else may come up with just because I'm too close to the project.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that you said, Daniel. Like, as a publisher, it's really nice when things are colorblind friendly, because like I have colorblind playtesters, and making that experience as nice as possible is good. But yeah, I could change everything.
Well, and I would say that yes, you consider colorblindness accessibility and stuff, because that's the easiest thing for you to do. More what I mean is spending a lot of time making icons and diagrams and all this other stuff. When you're testing and you need to rapidly revise your prototype, the more you invest in those visuals, if they take you a long time to do, that is time that you're not spending developing the game and revising it and polishing it up. And I think that's where your energies are best focused.
So you brought up earlier the difference between having cards in the hand and cards on the table. Could you go more into depth of like what kind of changes you would make depending on like if you had a card that was in the hand and now suddenly gameplay decides it's on the table?
Yeah. Let's see if I have a good example of that, actually. There are a couple of games where I've worked on recently where there's a significant amount of information that needs to be conveyed, but it's not on a card that you would hold in your hand. Say, for example, here. I didn't do too much on this. This was one of my coworkers who primarily worked in this game, but there's a game called Sidereal Confluence, and this is the update to that game. So I'm bringing up the rule book for that game now, and let me scroll over to a page layout that shows more of the cards. There's a lot of information here, so bear with me. Let's see if I can find a better one. Oh yeah, okay. So I can show you some stuff. So this is like what you would see on a table with 4 players. So on the top you have the green player, the bottom you have the red player, on the side you have the purple player, and on the other side you have the yellow player. As you can see, if you're sitting imagine yourself as the red player, looking across the table, seeing this breadth of stuff that you kind of have to take into account. Say right in front of you, this long bar, this board, that's the colony deck, and that shows you different planets that you can terraform. And so what I needed to show, what we needed to show was what resources that you would need to spend to flip that card over to its terraformed side. And so in this case, we had some like pre-existing legacy assets and conventions that we had to stick to from the first edition of the game. So we knew that these were going to be cubes. That meant that we showed cubes in the game. we knew that they were going to include cubes that were normally not colorblind friendly. So that would be a dark brown and a green. And so we had to make sure that whatever green we picked for the components and for the icons was a distinct enough hue that it wouldn't be confused for a dark brown if you had colorblind accessibility issues. And that isn't even just with your with whatever vision you may have. This could also just occur in dim lighting at a kitchen table or at a bar or something. So it's not just an accessibility issue. This is also something that applies to pretty much anybody in any game setting. And that's something I take seriously. But sorry, I'm getting sidetracked here. Other things, the cards that you use in this game are primarily what are called converters. They show one set of icons, one set of resources that convert to other sets of resources. You run those converters and they produce these goods that you can then trade sort of willy-nilly with the other players. It's a very free-form kind of game where you can do a lot of backstabbing if you wanted to, but at the same time, you can also allow other players to use your converters. And there's some slight variations that the different factions have and different abilities that they have whenever you're using their converters versus your own. And so you need to be able to see, like, real quick, okay, I can convert 2 greens to 1 blue and one brown. There are some cubes that are larger than others, and so we had to make sure that the icons for those cubes were significantly larger than the small versions, while at the same time not like filling up so much of the space that it created sort of a jumbled feeling. That's why we don't just maximize the amount of space we have for every single card, even though there may only be 2 or 3 icons on those. It would confuse things a little bit too much in the context of the entire card deck if some cards had huge icons that filled up the entire card, but if there was a more complicated converter that used smaller icons, you wouldn't get the sense of a consistent size language for those icons. And so I think this is kind of an example of a game where in some cases we use orientation of the card to represent different things. In this case, the colony planets are vertically oriented. The converters are horizontally oriented. Little things like that are things that I would use to show distinction between 2 sets of cards, but there's more cards than that. There's also these confluence cards that are stacked up over here, but they're splayed in such a way so that you can kind of see the point values that are available for each of those rounds of play. Yeah, I don't know if this is the best example. Let me see if I can find another one real quick. Let's do Seastead, something a little bit brighter. In this game, also a trading game, but it's only 2 players, and this is the print version of the rulebook, so you'll have to forgive the white margin that I have around here. But just imagine this as one coherent gameplay area. In this game, it's sort of a I cut you choose game. So over here, you can see this deck of cards over marked number 10. You would reveal one of those cards, and it would show these 4 icons. And you can kind of see an example of this gameplay over here on this page. You reveal one of those cards, and you divide up the resources that are shown on that card into 2 separate piles, and decide who amongst you are going to get each set. And ultimately, you're trying to just kind of cut the best deal so that you get the stuff that you need and don't give too much of the stuff that your opponent needs to your opponent. Then you just discard the card. In that case, these are actually mini cards. So there's not a lot of space to occupy too much information. So we had to do some fun stuff that I thought was kind of cool. This was a suggestion from the designers themselves, actually. In their prototype, they had some more advanced cards that say, for example, you had some random, or not random, but cards. We had an icon that represented a resource of your choice. And so some cards would say, for example, that you get 2 resources of your choice, and then your opponent gets 3 resources of your choice, or vice versa, that you would get 3 resources of your choice and your opponent would get 2. But the restriction was that in this first example, the pair had to be equal, that is the exact same resource, and then the trio of resources had to all be different. And so the original designers, they had their own icons for this. They just used equal and unequals. And so we just borrowed that. We polished it up and did some cool graphics around it. But the core, the skeleton of that basically remained the same because it was a good solution. And we couldn't find a better one that was as clear given the amount of space that was available on a mini card. And also the distance at which you would be looking at the card from across the table against your opponent. And that extended a little bit even to this more complicated example where you were splitting two pairs of resources between you and your opponent. Each of those resources had to be different, and the pairs could not have any resources in common either. So from the basic language of just showing different resources on each side of the card, all the way down to these more complicated examples. I think that kind of showed some of the sample solutions that we would take for a card game that didn't necessarily have you holding cards in your hand. There are other cards in this game that show specialists. And let's see if I can find an example of some specialists here. Browsing through a rule book. This is kind of a zooming in real quick here. What you're seeing on this page of the rulebook is what happens when you build different types of buildings onto your seastead. Seastead being a sort of a floating island that is compiled of a bunch of like boats and other like floating rafts and stuff. So when you build an academy, you get one of the specialist cards from the display on the side, and you put it in front of you. And in this case, we were exploring how we could convert some of the text on these cards into icons, especially since that some of the effects are fairly long and a little bit involved. A lot of them are conditional too, so they occur if you do a certain action, then that triggers a certain effect. But in this case, we decided that it would be best to keep this text, mainly because this is just a two-player game. These cards would be directly in front of you for most of the game. Most of the effects do not trigger based on what an opponent does, and so there wouldn't be much need for an opponent to look over the other side of the table and really see, oh, if I do this, is that going to trigger this thing? There wasn't really a lot of that in the game. So we felt that, okay, given the complexity and the amount of information that we need to convey and the space in which we have available to convey it, and the location of the cards for most of the game, there's not really a need for icons here. It would be nice, but it's not really an urgent need, and we have energies that we need to focus elsewhere in the game. So we did do icons for other cards that are called decrees. And you've probably seen a mechanic like this in other games where this is an advanced version of the game where every round or different phase of play, you would have a card that changes one of the rules of the game. This is a situation where we felt it would be necessary to have icons because on top of everything else happening in the game with building and trading resources and splitting the loot and all that stuff, we thought it would be useful to if you are using this variant of the game, that we can very quickly convey a sense of what the new state of play is. So in this case, after building a set of 3 buildings, you do some other stuff. And all of the decree cards show icons that represent what the effect is, so that once you've read what the effect is, you can just glance at it thereafter and see an example of what it does. We still kept the text very large. We still kept it there so that you can see details there, so you don't have to run to the rule book to get clarification or an FAQ or whatnot. This took a lot of editing to make sure the text was clear so that it could support the diagram and vice versa. But hopefully that shows some examples of how and when we would use text versus icons.
Yeah, that's really important. I really liked how you brought up that one where it had a lot of text, but since the other players, like, they couldn't affect it and they didn't really care, like, that's perfectly fine for them not to be able to read it. So that one's really good. We're getting to the end of it. Is there anything that you want to share? Or?
Let's see. Other stuff. The latest game is kind of fun. I don't know if this is the best place to show it, but I can show you. I can show you this. This is the rule book for a game that's coming up from Jeff Engelstein and WizKids game called Super Skill Pinball. It's a roll and write game themed around pinball. So you can see that this was a surprisingly challenging game to do the layout for because there's so few components. It's really just this pinball table in front of you, and then this back glass board that is above that. And you can see the amount of information that we have to convey on each table is pretty deep. And if you took a standard pinball table that you play in an arcade, you are overwhelmed with the amount of flashing lights and graphics and all this other stuff. But the core loop of play is fairly intuitive. You put your quarter in, you flip the flippers a little bit, you move the ball around, and stuff happens. Flashing lights happen, lasers go off, all sorts of sound effects. So this was an interesting situation where we had to not rely on that amount of visceral feedback that an actual pinball table had at its disposal. We only have this static roll and write board. And on top of that, it has to very clearly show information because we have no way of just sort of intuitively giving you feedback that you've done the right thing. So explaining the rules was one thing, and the rules go into a great deal of detail about steps of play, what actions are available to you. Each page, you can kind of see that the information density is actually fairly light. That we have a paragraph or two. We split up lines of text very broadly, and then we have big images showing exactly what this all means before we go to the next subject on the next page, where we outline that amount of information and that stuff that's going on there. This does result in a rule book that is a bit larger than I think a game of this complexity would imply. I think it ended up being about 32 pages. Part of that is because we go into such detail about the actual core rules of the game. That's only up to 15 pages. And then thereafter, each of the subsections within this rule book focus on the different tables. So in this case, the Carnival amusement park themed table, the cyberpunk hacking themed table, and all of its mechanics that are involved with that table. The fantasy Dragon Slayer one, which introduces like leveling and spell effects, and the disco one, which has a dance mechanic, which is real fun. You don't actually dance, but it's a cool like mini game where you're doing sort of a little mini pinball table, and it's cool. You should just check it out. This is a game where, on its face, it's fairly simple, and we do in fact have a downloadable PDF that basically breaks down the entire rule set for the main table and the main rules in just one page, double-sided. So just essentially 2 pages can cover the rules, but that's if we're trying to get as like concise as possible, not showing and covering every contingency that may occur as you're playing the game. That's what this rule book was for, and that was ultimately why we decided that, okay, we can have this very thorough rule book, but we should also include like a quick start guide that kind of goes over the basics if you just want to like, get started playing, or if you're the teacher of the game and you want to get a refresher because you played this game, you really like it, and you want to show your friends, and so you kind of take that little quick start guide and kind of use that as a teaching guide. But if you have specific questions, then you can kind of come back to this more comprehensive rules text. It's a little example, again, talking about information density, how you present information, and where you can make some compromises to best serve your needs.
What do you think of having like the different books? Like, having one book is very like intimidating to people sometimes, and what I've started to do is have like one rules book that goes over a generic game, and then another is that goes into like all the other things, like the particulars and the random things and the variants and whatnot. But like you brought up a different sort where it goes over like there's the quick start guide, which I normally just have that on the back, but like I thought it was a really cool idea just to have like a guide for all the things if you've already played or you want to learn, and then like the larger rule book. What do you prefer?
As a player, I'm often teaching a game, and the way I approach rulebook design is as if I am the like harried, nervous, sweaty person who's promised that this game is really fun. I promise. Let me just find out rules. Like I want to make that the rules as easy to parse and quickly to search as possible. But when that does result in a fairly large rule book, then in those cases, the size of that rule book is an intimidation factor all on its own. And sometimes you just have to like, well, okay, I have a quick start overview sheet available here that can talk me through the basics. And if there's multiple copies of it, that's great, because then I can just like give a reference card or something to each player. And they can kind of see where the rules are going as I'm kind of going over the more nitty gritty stuff. Or they can use it as a reminder in case I've already talked about it, and you're like, well, what was that rule like? Oh, it's right there. What's the next step of play? Oh, it's right there. There's other solutions to that. If it's a game that uses player screens, you can have that information literally in front of each player as they're going through the steps of play. That's nice. I like that. But if your game doesn't require player screens, then reference cards are great too. I tend to ramble. My apologies. But I think, yes, to answer your question, I think I prefer reference cards myself. Yeah. When you have a big, giant reference sheet, that can be a little bit cumbersome. I think when I play Small World, which I love, sometimes passing around multiple expansions worth of different factions, abilities, and using those reference cards, that can kind of fill up the table quite a bit. And so, it would be nice to just have a smaller reference. But I mean, there's not really much you can do in a game like that. There's just so much information that just has to fill up that amount of space. So, cards if possible, sheets if not. Yeah. Okay. There.
Well, one short follow-up to that. So like in my latest game, Tumbletown, I actually have 2 reference cards for each player, like how to do a turn, and then one for all the icons, and then also one for game setup. Like 3 reference cards. Is that too many reference cards, or when is it too much?
Setup cards are interesting. Is that a randomized setup?
No. It's by player.
Oh, so each player has their own setup?
Oh, I mean, it's like one game setup card that like you read it and you're like, oh, if it's 3 players, do this.
That's cool. The solution that I've seen from other games, there's a game I did the layout for Tasty Minstrel a couple of years ago called Chimera Station. And they had their solution to this was that they wanted each player to have a randomized amount of resources to start off with to get a little bit of opening granularity to the game. So each player randomly was dealt one of these random setup cards to tell them what they would get. But then what do you do with the cards? Like, it's just kind of sitting there thereafter. And so they actually made a very small but very nice mechanic where you turn that card over later in the game, and it had a special effect. I think it like reset the trash compactor, which like shuffled up a bunch of cards and stuff. And you can do that once per game. So they justified it and justified the presence of that card in that way. I don't know if necessarily you need to do that in every case, but I don't think that's too many cards. It depends on how many cards are. It depends on how crowded the play space is. You have to imagine where the footprint is for all these different components. But yeah, I don't think that's too bad.
Okay, one last question from Jack. Do you do consults to give advice on game and card layouts?
I used to. Unfortunately, because I am employed by WizKids Games, I am unable to do any freelancing or consulting for anybody else at the moment, at least as a freelancer. But if you go to my Patreon, you'll find lots and lots of tutorials and videos and blog posts going over all sorts of stuff. And I'm also available on Twitter if you want to ask me any questions. It's just Daniel Solis on Twitter, DanielSolis.
Is there anywhere else people can find you?
I think that's pretty much it. Yeah. If you have any questions, yeah, ask me on Twitter. I'm usually there. And if you want to give me $1 or $2, I'm more than happy to accept it on Patreon.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. You are amazing, and this was a fantastic hour. I hope everyone has a great weekend. And if you have any last words or thoughts?
Thank you. This is real fun. I'm glad that folks wanted to hear me ramble a little bit.
All right. Thank you all.